Part two of chapter one. And we're going to start this discussion with kind of a description of goods and services and how operations come into play in the production of either a good or a service. Now, first, I just want to mention that prior to the year 2000, operations management classes focused primarily on manufacturing operations, I would say. However, now in the US, as you'll see in some future slides in just a few moments, service industries have really become more prominent here. Thus, more focus has been given to them as well in these courses. Many of you, for instance, will go out and work in a service industry as opposed to a manufacturing industry. But first, let's take a look at the definitions of goods and services. So when I talk about goods, essentially, I am referring to economic commodities that are tangible, usually can be moved, and are generally not consumed or used at the same time as they are produced. So they're typically manufactured in one place, and then they are used by a customer somewhere else. So that can be, I mean, you look around wherever you are right now, you have goods. So your computer, whether it's a laptop, whether it's your smartphone or whatever you're using to view this video on, that's a good. If you're writing notes, your pencil, your paper, your tablet, if you're typing them in somewhere, your clothing that you're wearing are goods, so goods are everywhere that we look. There's no way that we can escape seeing goods in our environment. Services, on the other hand, are economic activities, and they typically produce what's considered to be an intangible product as opposed to a tangible product. And that is, since you're sitting here in this lecture, video recorded lecture, education is an example of a service. So you don't get something necessarily tangible out of it, even though some might say this video can actually be moved and consumed at a different time because I'm producing it at a different time as you are viewing it. But in general, education, the typical in-classroom education is considered to be a service. Same as entertainment. If you were to go to a concert, that's a service. Lodging, the bed that may be in the lodging facility may be a good, but the actual process of lodging somebody is a service. Our government services, financial services, health services, those all fall underneath services, of course. Okay, for some reason, I can't advance. There we go. All right. So just to continue, most services have at least one facilitating good associated with it. That's why when I was giving the example of services, I kind of deviated and talked about a good that might be linked to that service. So even if you go to a restaurant, you're going to the restaurant and you're being served, but what you're being served are actually goods. And so there are facilitating goods that are associated with the service that you are receiving. Here are just a couple of other ways to kind of define that. Manufacturers, of course, produce a tangible product. And of course, services are intangible, as was mentioned previously. Those operation activities are actually performed in both manufacturing and service rendering companies. So we're in an operations management class, but of course, we're going to be flip-flopping between goods and service producing businesses as we go along. The distinction is not always clear, and I think you can kind of see that in the way that I described some of the elements in the previous slide. The distinction between a good and a service is not always clear, like in the hotel example, the lodging example. So the lodging process itself is a service, but in order to lodge somebody, you have to have a room, you have to have a bed, you have to have, certain tangible items in order for you to actually perform that service. And few services are pure services, meaning there are no facilitating goods associated with them. But again, let's take a look at some examples here. So this figure here kind of gives you an idea of the percent of the activity here that is actually good, which you see on the left-hand side, versus a service. So if we look at takeout food, when you go and get takeout, what you're typically going there for is the food itself. So you see that the majority of the activity associated with takeout food is in the goods producing portion of that activity. But then, of course, in order for you to actually get that, you have to have some service associated with it. So in that respect, you have a percentage lower than the goods, but there's a percentage of service that accompanies that particular activity there. So as you can see, with the exception of the lawn cutting business here, that each of these items is a combination of both goods and services. Even jumping up to the massage, the physical activity of the massage is a service. It's not tangible. It's something that's being done to you, for instance, but they use goods in that process. So you're getting massage oil on you, or you may be walking away with some product that they use during that massage process. So those are just kind of giving you some examples of how that distinction can be kind of tricky to make between a good or a service. This slide provides additional characteristics that enable you to distinguish between a good and a service. Just to look at a couple of the rows, I already mentioned the intangible versus tangible for a service versus a good. One thing I want to mention is services are typically kind of unique in their output. Let's put it like that. The service itself may not be unique in general, but the output may be unique. So when you go to a hospital and you're being served for a specific ailment. That ailment may be different from the last 100 people who came into the same hospital before you. So in that respect, it is more unique. Whereas when it comes to goods, on a manufacturing line, they put in a batch of products and everything that comes out of that product line is going to be similar. So, iPads, earbuds are the examples mentioned here. But again, looking at pretty much anything that's in front of you that is considered a good, you would see that there are going to be produced in batches or in large amounts, unless they're customized, highly customized at that. Another thing to point out is that services are typically dispersed. So in terms of hospitals, you don't see, now sometimes there may be systems of hospitals that are close to one another, but you're going to want to have those hospital services dispersed so that people can be close to them. So if all of our hospitals, for instance, were located in downtown Greensboro and there are no other hospitals until you get to downtown Winston-Salem, that's not going to be very helpful for society. So you have this dispersion to make sure that they are relatively close, the services are being provided relatively close to individuals who will need them. Whereas when it comes to a product, there may be a manufacturing facility, let's say, BMW, we have a BMW manufacturer in South Carolina. There's no other BMW manufacturer close to that. There's not one here in North Carolina. And so even though we may have people who buy BMWs here in North Carolina, some of them anyway, are being produced in South Carolina instead. And so it's not necessary to have a good produced close to the people who are going to actually buy and utilize that product. Quality is, I mentioned quality is going to be something that we hit hard in this course. Quality for services can be very challenging to evaluate because, number one, of that uniqueness of the output. Also because, there are individuals who are performing those tasks that are associated with the services. But not only that, the individuals who are receiving that may have a different perspective of what quality is. Whereas with a product, we pretty much have clear expectations of what we want out of a product. And so it's easier to be able to assess the quality of a product because we have more clear-cut characteristics that we're looking for and functionality that we're looking for in those products. So for my laptop here, when it was purchased, there were specific things that I expected it to be able to perform. And those things are the same things that pretty much any other individual who has one of these computers expects it to perform. But let's say I go to a hairdresser and go get my hair done. Now, what I consider to be a nice looking hairstyle may be different from what you consider to be a nice looking hairstyle. So in terms of the quality of the hairstylist, it may differ in terms of, number one, their ability to actually meet my expectations versus your expectations. But also, just the perception of what quality is. So for me, quality in a hairdresser means that they can get me in and out pretty quickly as well. So not only the style, but also the amount of time that it takes for them to complete the style. Whereas some people may not have a problem staying in the hairdresser for half the day. That doesn't really measure into quality. They're all focused on what is the output, that the final product or the final outcome of the styling. So what does their hair look like, when they come out? So those are just some examples. But read through, each one of these, take some time and make sure you understand the distinction between goods and services. This slide helps to illustrate the shift in the business sectors over the course of the years. As you can see here, the x-axis shows the years from 1800 to what's estimated for 2025, which is coming up quickly. And the y-axis shows the percentage of the workforce that was in the various business sectors of agriculture, which is shown in the blue, services, which is shown in the red, and manufacturing, which is shown in green. So as you can see, agriculture has steadily decreased from the 1800s to now, where there's very minimal agriculture in comparison to the 1800s, very minimal agriculture today, and even less expected in the near future. Whereas manufacturing, it started out kind of low, but then it picked up during kind of the Industrial Revolution and kind of leveled off, between the late 1800s and the mid 1900s when it started to decrease. So we are still in this decline in terms of manufacturing employment here in the United States. But you see on the service side, we were really low on services in the 1800s, but it continued to climb. It is still climbing today in terms of the number of jobs that or the percent. I just want to clarify that. It's not the number, it's the percent of jobs that are in the US that are within service industries. So you kind of see how that flip has happened. This table gives you an idea of the percentage of US jobs that fall within various business sectors and their subsectors, along with some example businesses based on the 2020 census data, the Bureau of Labor Statistics data. So you can kind of see here within the service sector, these are some of the subsectors, the education, trade, professional services, leisure, so on and so forth. And you can see some of the examples that are here, some of which are mentioned in your textbook even. And you can see the percentage of jobs within the US that fit within that sector. So in 2020, based upon the 2020 data, so it's probably almost definitely increased at this point in time. I just don't have the exact data, but 85.7% back in based on the 2020 data was in the service sector, whereas in the manufacturing sector here in the United States, less than 8%, and construction, 4.6%, agriculture, less than 2%, so on and so forth. So that just kind of gives you an idea of the distribution. So if I were to poll the class, I would not be surprised to see, more than 75% of you actually working in a service industry at this point in time for those who are employed. While the perception is that service jobs pay lower wages in some cases, the fact is that many service jobs pay very well. Some of yours that you may have, you can probably see that firsthand. But because service jobs are the types of service jobs are so broad, from being a waiter or waitress, those jobs pay very low. Retail jobs, if any of you have worked as a retail counter associate at the counter, then those jobs don't pay very high. So when those are all factored in, it does kind of drive the average wage of service jobs down. But 42% of service workers do actually receive above average wages. But because 14 of the 33 service industries pay well below average, that drives the national average down. But the overall average is about 96% of the average when it comes to the wages of service workers. Now, this is the last topic that we will actually cover in this chapter, productivity. So you see up here, productivity challenge. It is well known that the more efficiently businesses are able to convert their resources into their final goods or services, the more productive they are considered to be, and the more value is usually added to the product or service as well. So from a quantitative standpoint, productivity is the ratio of outputs, which are those goods and services, divided by the inputs, which are those resources that are required to go into a process to produce those goods and services, such as labor and capital resources, which could be money or equipment or what have you. The objective, of course, is pretty clear, that we want to improve productivity, and that's what operations managers are often tasked to do, is to improve the productivity of the processes that they are in charge of. Now, an important note here is that production is a measure of only the output, and it is not necessarily a measure of efficiency. And the same with productivity in general. So that numerator in the equation is a numeric value of how much product comes out of a process. And so the productivity calculation does not necessarily measure efficiency. There are other means by which efficiency is measured. And we'll likely cover that in later chapters in the textbook. So just to make sure that you have a clear understanding of inputs and outputs, we take a look at what we call the economic system. So this slide shows a very simplified view of the economic system. There are three components here, which are inputs, which, as I mentioned before, are labor, can be capital in the form of financial resources, human resources fit in the labor, but capital resources, equipment, facilities, so on and so forth. And then you have management, which are the people who actually, facilitate the production of whatever the good and service might be. So those inputs are actually put through a transformation process, and this process enables the inputs to be converted or transformed, that's the word transformation, into the outputs, okay? Annual productivity increases can result from either capital, labor, or management efficiency improvements. So we can decrease the number of labor hours required, or decrease the financial investment required to create those goods and services. We could decrease the number of managers involved, which of course they're typically salaried workers. So decreasing that, again, reduces the amount of money that goes into the production. Outputs at the end here are, of course, the actual goods and services that are produced. But notice that there is a feedback loop, and that feedback loop goes back into the transformation process and can even go all the way back to the inputs. So it includes the evaluation of performance against established standards, as well as customer satisfaction evaluations. So based upon the feedback that's received, you may make changes in those inputs, or you make changes in those processes. Information obtained through these feedback loops are used to make those process improvements that are deemed economical and effective. And so you kind of see some percentages here where it says, the U.S. economic system transforms inputs into outputs with the annual productivity increasing by about 2.5%. So some of those productivity improvements probably have to do with changes in or advances in technology. So that technology allows us to reduce the amount of labor that goes into a process, reduces waste, so on and so forth. So productivity increase in the result of contributions from capital, or increases result from capital, labor, and management modifications that may be made. So these are just kind of estimated percentages of the effect. So 38% of the time, these productivity increases are the result of capital improvements, 10% the result of labor improvements, and 52% the result of management improvements. So that kind of explains a little bit what's in this transformation box there. Here is an actual example of how a company we are all familiar with was able to improve their productivity. So a group of Starbucks analysts were tasked with finding ways to decrease customer wait time. Some of their improvement efforts included not requiring signatures on credit card purchases that were under $25. This in and of itself shaved off 8 seconds per transaction. They changed the size of the ice scoop to reduce the number of times a barista had to bend down to scoop out ice for particularly venti sized beverages. And this saved approximately 14 seconds per drink. And they also purchased a new espresso machine that ground the coffee beans and brewed the coffee, which meant that the barista was free to perform other tasks while this was going on. And this saved approximately 12 seconds per shot of espresso. And so even though these look kind of minimal, they add up over the course of time. So these were just some changes that were implemented. And as a result, the operations improvements helped the company increase their yearly revenue per outlet, or per Starbucks, by $250,000 to $1 million. Okay. So productivity improved 27%, or about 4.5% if looked over the course of a year. So while the savings and time of these improvements may appear minimal, when accumulated over the course of the year, they became quite significant. Okay. All right. So again, we're going to break here, and we will pick up with the last portion with some calculations on productivity.